Welcome, everybody, to another episode of This, That, and the Other. Tonight's panelist is tangocbear, otherwise known as Josie. He's been a member since October of 2008. Yeah, 2008. Over 4,400 victories with a 789 winning percentage. 123 of those victories have been conference championships and 13 national championships. Quite the resume, Josie. Welcome.
Oh, actually, my real name's Rich, but
Reg? Well,
Rich.
There you go, Reg. So it says Josie on the screen.
That's my paralegal. She must. But no. Yeah, I've done okay, but I haven't won a lot of championships given how long I've played.
Well, I tell you, you've got more than most people that play the game, especially the newcomers. Of course, they haven't had a chance to get those titles yet. Tell us about that first one that you won. What was that feeling like?
The first national title I won, I believe, was Syracuse in Yost. And I had, it wasn't. I'm sorry. It was Randolph-Macon in Warner Division III. And back in those days, Warner Division III was a very real world. It was probably a third full, which now you don't see at all in Division III.
No, not at all.
And there were a lot of coaches in that division who had D1 and some elite teams in other worlds. So it was a super, super competitive world. And I had Randolph-Macon, and I inherited it, and I was able to take them. They were a really good team, and I was able to get them over the finish line and win a national title, which was great.
Now, was that back when it was even more basic than it is now as far as Division III, what you can do with your team?
Yeah, it was pretty basic, but everything was the same. You know, no matter what division you were in, you had the same options,
right,
which were limited, more limited than they are now. And I'm trying to think if it was what are we on now? Version 2 point something?
Yeah, 370, 90, I don't know.
I think I started playing when it was version 2, and version 2 was very run oriented. Mm-hmm. I won a national title. I think I threw 20 times in 17 games, and half of them were the national championship.
Wow. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty run oriented at that
and
point.
That was not unusual.
Yeah.
Back in those days. I mean, you could win. I mean, in fact, it was very hard it was hard to win if you didn't run all the time. Your game just was not set up to favor passing. And that changed when they went to, I don't know, what is it, version 3, I guess, or
mm-hmm.
2 point. They switched to a new version, and the game became a lot more pass friendly and a lot more realistic. I mean, frankly, to how football's been played since about 1920.
So what do you think your strengths are then in this game? Is it specifically recruiting, game planning, or your particular scouting abilities of your opponents?
It's not game planning. I think I'm a pretty good recruiter. I think if you look at, Bob Hazelwood's website, Guest Reports, I typically do pretty well in recruiting. Mm-hmm. I've done well in, with probably about 10 different Division I teams. Some of them elites, some of them not, all over the country. And that's probably my strong suit is recruiting. I have some simple rules that I follow for myself. And if I don't deviate from them, I tend to do very well.
Is there a particular area of the country that you like to recruit at, a particular school, I should say, in a particular area?
I have LSU, as you know,
right.
in Stag. And I've had a lot of fun there. I had a lot of fun in Stag at Florida, but Gainesville is a tough spot to recruit from.
It is. It is.
It's very challenging, but it was a lot of fun. LSU is great, and it's not nearly, frankly, as challenging as Baton Rouge. I mean, as Gainesville. Baton Rouge is a really good location, so mm-hmm. that's a lot of fun. I had UConn for a while in Yost, and I did really well there. And I had some great battles with J.C. McGarry. He was at Boston College. Mm-hmm. You see J.C. around in some of the different worlds. He's a really good coach. So those are probably the most, memorable ones.
Well, you've got a Duke team now that's not an elite, of course, the only non-elite that you have. And I hear you're playing one of the best coaches in all of Gridiron Dynasty sometime after you beat me. Because we actually face off tonight, and in my Virginia Tech team, I'm certain will get slaughtered. It's
well, you said that last season and you won. So
they last season, I swear they were on something. I don't know what happened to that group, but
you beat Miami.
Yeah,
this season.
Well, I think they've been drinking something. I don't know, but I do not anticipate a victory no matter what we do. You could probably start my scrubs and still win.
Oh, I don't know about that.
The starters are pitiful, but you've got the Duke team that's not an elite. How difficult is it being in North Carolina where you not only have to deal with Penn State not being too far away, Ohio State's within reach. You've got
Tennessee.
Yeah, Tennessee's right there. Plus, on top of that, you've got Maryland, North Carolina State, Wake Forest, Virginia Tech, Georgia, Clemson, South Carolina. I mean, I could go on. That's got to be a tough recruiting bid. Why are you doing that?
Well, it's funny. I think, I had Boston College in Bryant before I moved to Duke. Mm-hmm. And I always wanted to try BC. BC is another great location to recruit from, especially if there's no UConn player. And it got kind of boring, to be honest with you. And Duke, Jay Winter had done a really good job building up Duke. And it seemed like a really good challenge, and it's extremely challenging. Mm-hmm. I had some preparation for it. I had Navy in both Stag and Rockney. And so I was familiar with generally, Mid-Atlantic. So I had some idea of what I was in for, but, I had no idea, when you're with Navy, you don't have to go for as many top recruits, it's the Sun Belt. Yeah. With Duke, you got to press and you got to fight for some good recruits. And, having Penn State, you got Penn State, Tennessee, and Ohio State all jumping recruits in Virginia, North Carolina, and even South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And then you got to worry about, if you go into Georgia, you got to worry about Florida and Florida State.
Right.
So it's, it's very challenging.
And then every once in a while, you'll have that prestigious D1 AA school that rears its head and comes in there and tries to throw some money on your recruits that, although they may not win, they suck some of that recruiting fund.
Yeah, although, you have to deal swiftly with that.
Yeah.
And if you have an elite, right, and a non-elite, especially from a non-BCS conference, tries to jump one of your recruits, you just have to put the hammer down so that nobody gets the idea that that's a good idea.
Right.
I can't do it at Duke, but I could do it at Boston College and UConn. You can do it with an elite in your own area. One of my rules for LSU is I own Louisiana.
Right.
And I own the part of Mississippi that's within my 180 and no one else's. Okay. And, part of Mississippi I share with Alabama, but part of Mississippi, LSU is the only elite and often the only team. And there's a little slice of Alabama along the Gulf Shore. And then there's a little slice of East Texas, right? Where LSU is the only elite and often the only team. And nobody gets a recruit in that area that I want.
Do you get much pressure from Houston being there at LSU?
If I try to go into Houston, right, it's outside my 180s.
Right.
So it's in my 360, but it's in their 180. I'm an elite, they're not. So it's kind of an even fight. I have battled Houston maybe once or twice, but, one of the things I've noticed a lot of times is coaches sometimes intimidate themselves, right? Like, I can't recruit against, I'm not in a BCS conference. I can't recruit against BCS teams. Well, that's not true.
Yeah.
When I was if you look at my record at Navy, I did very well with a Sun Belt team. I don't know that I could challenge Penn State, but, I could battle Rutgers, right? I could battle the ACC non-elites. but I think a lot of times people get psyched out when they see an elite, jump on a recruit they're interested in, because, the elite does have an advantage, but, it's not insurmountable.
Sure, sure.
If you have a distance advantage, that pretty much cancels out the elite advantage. So now it really comes down to who has the most spaces to fill, right? How you're doing on your other recruiting. But I think a lot of times people psych themselves out, especially if they're new, if they're not experienced in Division One, right? Like they see, oh, like I can't beat LSU, so they back off.
And it makes it easier for you, which exacerbates the situation and fortifies that belief that, you're the almighty at LSU or any elite for that matter. What would you give to a person who is a coach who has moved up to D1A for his very first time? What would you give to him for recruiting advice?
The first cycle is going to be rough. You're not going to have bowl money, and it's very hard to recruit in D1 without bowl money. And, you don't know D1 recruiting, so you're going to be at a disadvantage, and you haven't figured out who all these D1 coaches are. It's going to be rough. I mean, if you look at, every time I've gone into a world, other than when I went into Yoast, and even then, every time I've gone into a world in the D1 level, even like now, that first year is tough because, you don't have bowl money. And, if you're taking over a team that's bad, you can at least offer starting positions and playing time in a meaningful way. Mm-hmm. But it's rough, and you got to be patient. That's my advice to everybody. I tell everybody who asks me about recruiting, you got to be patient. There are good players that stay available, well into the second day of recruiting. And if you're patient, you can find them, and if you haven't blown all your money on other stuff, you'll have money to go get them. It's patience. Yeah. Well, it's like cat-like. You got to be patient, but when it's time, you got to pounce.
Right. And I think a lot of the first-time D1 coaches see that big recruiting pot, especially if they've got a class in excess of 15, 18 players. That's a ton of money, and you've been dealing with the minuscule funds at D3 or D2, and then a little bit more, of a bucket to play with at D1 AA. But when you get up to D1, you think, the world is mine. I can go get who I want. I've got all this money. But the reality is you're way behind because, as you mentioned, the existing teams have all that bowl money. And whatever little bit of carry money they have, carryover money from previous recruiting. So, that's one of the things I think a lot of coaches find themselves early on, especially within their first 2 years, for lack of a better term, getting bitch slapped because they think they've got all this money, but so does everybody else, and they don't realize that.
Yeah, that's it. It's definitely an awakening. Like I said, it's always been hard. It's hard to break into D1, even as an experienced coach, because you don't have the bowl money. Mm-hmm. And I also gauge a lot of my recruiting on the other players. Like, I have LSU and Stag, right? I know what Chetty, who has Florida, is going to do. And I know what Dino does at Alabama. Okay. And I know what BJ Schumacher at Tennessee does. And I even know what GOAT at Texas does because it affects me.
Yeah.
And so, I've played with many of these guys now for 5-6 years. I have a pretty good idea, especially because I was at Florida, right, of sort of their recruiting philosophies and their personalities. Until you know that, it's just you're flying blind.
Is there one coach in particular that you just hate to see on your recruits? Because you know you're in for a battle.
I don't know. I don't know. I feel like there are coaches I worry about playing that, like, I think they have my number, but I've never felt like, I've been, like, God, I can't recruit against this guy. I've always had good confidence there. There are some really good recruiters, but, I've never felt like intimidated or worried that, like, oh, I've lost battles, but I win battles, and so I feel, as long as I stick to I have metrics, I have a plan, I have a philosophy, and as long as I stick to that, I generally do really well.
Now, it sounds like you've got the recruiting aspect down pretty good when you mentioned your plan and your matrix, but what about your team makeup itself? You've got 3 teams right now,
Yeah.
one a non-elite. Do you set all of them up the same way as far as your philosophies go, offense and defense, or does it depend if one's an elite or not?
It's interesting. My defense, I play a 43 nickel defense in all 3.
Okay.
And
Let me
I
make
have
some notes for tonight.
I've always played, with the exception of when I had Navy and Rockney, I always have played a 43 nickel defense. I inherited Boston College. They had a 34. So I stayed with the 34, but it wasn't my preference. It's just they had formation IQ. So I adapted myself to my players rather than, the other way around.
The other way around.
On offense, I mean, Duke, I inherited. Jay Winter ran the I, so I run the I. Let's see. Oklahoma was a pro set team. I run the pro set. LSU, when I got it, well, it's interesting. In Stag, I have alternated between a pro set and trips. And right now, I'm only running trips in Stag. And my LSU team is set up to do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned you did run some 3-4 because the team was set up that way when you got there.
Yeah.
But you prefer the 4-3 and a nickel. I'm assuming that's for a run focus as well as a passing focus.
Yeah, I mean, the 43 is, it's a standard NFL defense, right? It's a good defense. And I think it's a little bit better than the 34 stopping the run, and I've always played the 43, so I have a lot more experience with how it works than the 34.
Now, I've heard other coaches mention in passing that they prefer the 3-4 defense because good quality defensive linemen are more scarce than quality linebackers. Have you found that to be true, or how do you feel your linebackers? And
I think it's exactly the opposite. I think it's harder to find good linebackers than it is to find. Actually, I think it's hard to find really good linemen or really good linebackers.
Mm-hmm.
It's harder to find good linebackers than it is good defensive linemen.
What do you look for? At
least in my experience.
Well, I should say, what do you consider to be a good linebacker? What do you look for? Or is there a difference between someone that you're recruiting primarily to put in a pass coverage or someone that you're going to use exclusively for running?
I mean, if you're playing the 43, your outside linebackers have to be able to cover.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're gonna get
Absolutely.
toasted.
Absolutely.
For the inside linebacker, I won 2 national titles at UConn with a starting middle linebacker at a speed of 43.
Ugh.
But he had a strength over 90, a tackling over 90.
That's what you want.
High game instinct and high technique. And he couldn't cover, but if somebody was running inside the tackles and the lineman didn't get him, he could clean that up. So on the inside, I'll take a linebacker who doesn't have good speed if I know I can stick him on the inside. Mm-hmm. And when I had the 34 at Boston College, my 2 inside linebackers often were not particularly fast. Usually one of them was decent in case I wanted to have 3 linebackers in coverage, right? But if you're going to play outside linebacker, you got to have speed.
Right. Now, you mentioned this particular linebacker with a 90-90 on those strength and tackling. Have you ever used that to kind of prompt you into moving him to a defensive lineman, given he would have better speed when the conversion is done?
I don't know. If you look at, if you look at the conversions, it never seems to work out that it's an improvement.
Mm-hmm.
You can see what a guy will convert to before you convert him.
Right. Right.
And it's never been particularly appealing to me.
So you've never recruited a guy with the intention of doing that just so you can change his position later on?
No, but I've recruited, I recruited the guy with the 43 speed knowing that he would never be in pass coverage.
Right.
And, he didn't start until he was a junior, but he started 2 seasons and I won 2 national championships. So my defense couldn't have been horrible.
Now, what do
You
you look
know,
for as far as your defensive backs go, your safeties versus cornerbacks? How do you decide who you're putting where?
I mean, I use Bob Hazelwood's formulas.
Mhm.
I mean, the difference most players have is marginal between, corner and safety, but I generally follow his formula when I, position people. If you
How
go to
much?
guest reports, he has his formulas that he uses to rate the different
Right.
positions.
Yeah. Yeah. How much emphasis do you put on practice? You say you do usually have 2 defenses
Yep.
and 1 offense. And I know currently there's a discussion going on the forums regarding how much time to put on multiple formations, single formations, without giving away too many of your trade secrets. What's kind of the go-to mindset for you when it comes to practice?
Um, I mean, one of the reasons why I only run one formation on offense is so that I can devote more minutes to skills,
Mm-hmm.
you know, um, and it's manageable. It's hard to run only one, defense because you're not going to be able to cover passing and, you're not going to be able to defend the run that effectively from the dime or the nickel. So you kind of got to run 2 defenses. But I mean, the old rule of thumb way back in the day when I started was anything over 20 minutes is a waste.
Yeah. I think
So,
diminishing returns was the
right.
coined phrase back then, that after 20 minutes, you pretty much were just wasting your time.
And I don't know that anyone's ever proven that wrong.
Mhm.
So, that's the most I will ever spend on anything in terms of minutes.
Does that change your practice allocation of time at the different levels? Do you put more practice time on formations at D1 than you do D3, let's say?
Yeah, because in theory, the lower division players have more room to grow. At least that
Right.
was the conventional wisdom way back in the day. I don't know if that's true, but that was always the conventional wisdom. So yes, in D3, I would never run more than one formation on offense ever, which is how I got into the habit of only doing that, one formation when I got up to D1. And there were plenty of people who were very successful, especially before the game was more pass oriented, running one defensive formation in Division 3, and then
Mhm.
just spending all their, the rest of their time practicing skills.
What is the, I shouldn't, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. What is your go-to offensive set as far as whether you're trying to run outside, inside, short, long? Which one do you find you have the most success with?
I think the trips is the best formation to run out of because it tends to force people to play the nickel, which is not as effective at stopping the run. Because if you try to play a 43 defense against the trips, you're probably going to get smoked.
Exactly. Yep. Deep.
So basically, you're creating a positional, advantage by forcing that linebacker out in favor of a defensive back to guard against the pass, making it easier to run. I mean, I've had great success running the ball out of the trips, and I've never had a problem with that. And a lot of times you catch people unaware because they think, oh, you're in 3 wide receivers, you're going to throw the ball a lot, right? And then they
Mhm.
wise up and they realize every time they play you, you're running the trips and, you're running the ball a lot. And then they maybe cheat and try to play the 43 against you. And, you can burn them there. The tougher is if they play the nickel, but now they're not covering with all 5 defensive backs, right? That's a little more subtle, but I've always had great success running out of the trips.
Well, let's talk a bit about you personally. We'll get into whatever you're willing to divulge. Normally on the podcast, we always did the who you are, where you're from, what do you do, how did you get your name type thing. So it's your turn on that. How did you come about Tango Bear?
When I was a kid, I had a small rubber orange bear, whose name was Tangerine Sea Bear. When I first came into WIS, somebody thought it's because I was like, you know, a Baylor fan and talking about a year they went to the Tangerine Bowl.
Oh, wow.
You know,
That's
but
a
it was
stretch.
as simple as I had an orange rubber bear when I was a kid.
So where are you from?
I'm from Massachusetts, near
Mm-hmm.
Cape Cod, and I live in Connecticut now, not too far from the casinos.
Uh-oh. Are they about to open back up?
Yeah, the governor doesn't want them to, but you know they're sovereign.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to reopen.
Yeah. What what is it that you do for a living, if you're willing to share?
Sure, I'm a lawyer.
Lawyer, okay. How long you been doing that?
I got out of law school in the fall of '93,
All right. So
and
quite
I've been
some
in
time.
private practice since then.
So you looking to sue anybody if they beat you too bad?
I, I mean, they'll countersue for negligence. You know, I mean,
if it's me, it just be dumb luck if I won, especially tonight. That's all I can say about that. Just pure dumb luck. If you weren't
don't
a
jinx
lawyer,
me.
what would you see yourself doing?
If I weren't a lawyer, I'd love to have been a writer or a sports writer. I worked in my local newspaper when I was in high school,
Oh, wow.
and I was a stringer, you know, on the sports page for a while, which was a lot of fun. But it's hard to make a living as a writer or a sports writer.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, we're hitting on our 30-minute
All
mark.
right.
We're going to go ahead and wrap it up. But before we go, what's the one thing you want to share with the community that you think is beneficial for them?
Don't give up, don't get frustrated, and recruit one or two of your friends so that the game doesn't die.
There you go. Appreciate you. Thanks so much.
All right,
Reggie, we
Missy.
do appreciate appreciate you being on with us, and we look forward to interacting with you on other shows.
Great. Good luck tonight.
Yeah, you too. Keep them healthy. Folks, this has been another episode of This, That, and the Other. I'm your host, Magic. Come back next Thursday for another one. Who knows? Who's it going to be? Let's see. I believe it's going to be, looks like Jason Freeman
Oh,
and Mr. St. Olaf. mfnmyers.
two long-time coaches.
So it should be a good one again. So again, thanks so much, and we'll see y'all next time.
Take care.